Welcome to Responding to Climate Change webcast number 5. It's the second Monday of COP17, and today it's Gender Day in Durban. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by two experts in the subject of gender and climate change. Gotelind Alba from RTCC, Women for Climate Justice, welcome, and Winnie Byanyima, Director of the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme Gender Team. Winnie, if I could start with you. Many people might say, what has gender got to do with climate change? What would be your answer to that?
Everything. Worldwide, women contribute 2/3 of the world's working hours. They only get 10% of the income, and they control only 1% of the property. In Africa, women constitute about 70% of the total agricultural labor force, but own less than 10% of the land. They also contribute 90% of the work that's undertaken to collect water, to collect firewood, to sustain livelihoods in the home. So you see that women in the developing countries are heavily reliant on natural resources to sustain livelihoods. And this fact of the work that they do, the disproportionate share of unpaid work, the fact that they have restricted voice and decision making, the fact that they have unequal access to these same resources that they need, all these make them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but they also make them important actors in adaptation and in mitigation of climate change because of their skills and knowledge in natural resource management. So it's all about men and women in their households, in their communities, and addressing the different constraints that they face as the climate impacts on them.
And Gotelind, has it been hard for groups like yourself to actually get this on the agenda at events like COP17 and the other climate conferences?
I would say it took a while. I cannot say it was hard because it was also, it was very challenging, but also really interesting work we've been doing. So we started like nearly almost 10 years ago with awareness raising, in particular about the impacts, gendered impacts of climate change. So what Winnie just has been explaining, and now are moving forward to also raise issues around gender and finance, gender and mitigation, because now the gendered impacts and the vulnerability, specific vulnerability of women, I think this is pretty much acknowledged now in this context, but there's still some gaps to fill. And I think who was contributing to this progress we have made is on one hand the NGOs, civil society. I think it was primarily civil society that started to bring in gender, women's groups, women and gender experts, but also then development organizations. The UN agencies helped a lot, and there was also a network of women ministers who played, at least in the beginning, quite an important role. And there are some governments that are really helpful to introduce gender language into the text. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank them all, because I think we've made real progress. We are now acknowledged as our own constituency, observer constituency, women and gender, and thereby we have a lot more options for interactions in this process.
Was it hard at the start to get this issue recognized by governments across the world?
In the beginning, I think it was pretty hard, because usually people say, if you talk about gender and climate change, they say, well, but climate change affects everybody, everybody contributes to climate change. And in particular, in this negotiations, so this is a UN process, and of course, here, the gap between developed and developing countries and the inequity and all these equity issues, they play a major role. And so within this process, it's more difficult to look into inequalities within countries. because that's not really part of the topic. But of course, these inequalities are there, and they affect well policies and whatever is done on climate change. And so I think it needs to be raised here, but it's still a bit difficult.
If I can come in here and agree with Gottlieb that there were difficulties in bringing the gender issues in this discussion, and they continue to be some constraints. Why? Let me give you an example. When we as the United Nations went to the Secretariat, the UNFCCC, to ask for a space for addressing these issues, I remember very well that we were told by a very high-ranking official that these negotiations are highly technical and politically sensitive, and that it would be unwise to introduce gender issues. That's like 4 or 5 years ago. Now, that statement about politically sensitive and technically and highly technical, we continue to face that, because here you're talking about a real discussion about equity issues between developing countries that feel that have a right to their development unconstrained by climate considerations, and compensation in some way by the countries that have contributed most to climate change, and that they see as a major contradiction. And when you bring in aspects of equity at the household level, equity for women in the market, equity for other groups, to some it appears that you are clouding the major issues that they are fighting on. The emerging economies, the least developed countries, the small island states who feel they are going to perish, men and women alike. So to actually then dissect it further and show the difference that even in a household, it becomes quite a challenge. It becomes a question of what should we focus on. And we say you have to focus on inequities across the board, because the issues are interlinked. So it's been a challenge and continues to be a challenge, even to get the North and the South to hold hands together on these questions, to have the solidarity to look at these issues from one perspective, as people, as women from the South and women from the North, taking these issues on together. It has been an issue of careful construction of an agenda together.
And when we look at the work that's been done over the past 10 years in terms of gender and development, could you both give me some examples of how perhaps the debate has changed, and perhaps how policies have changed to incorporate the views, the needs, the values of women moving forward, both in development and climate change? We start with you, Gottlieb.
Yeah, it's hard to say because we have some provisions in the text on gender that is relevant for developing countries, that is relevant also for development cooperation. But I'm not sure whether this really, was introduced in the actual implementation. So, for instance, we're still lacking of methodologies for instance, in terms of vulnerability assessment, that really find out the specific vulnerabilities of women within the community. And we're still lacking of let's say, instruments and tools how to, or guidelines how to address it. So, for instance, in the NASA, in the National Adaptation Programs of Action, women and gender issues played a pretty small role. And we hope that this will improve in the new NAPs, the new adaptation programs. I think that is very important, and also for finance. That's of course a crucial issue, but in order to be able to benefit from the financial flows that are, that have been promised, it needs some preconditions. So you need to have for instance, access to land, or you need to be able to make some investments. For instance, if you want to benefit from the CDM, you need to have capital to make investments, and that's, for many women in the world, far beyond their possibilities. And I think we need to link also the women's rights issues with the provisions in this process.
Well, we have been making some progress, quite a lot of progress, because I can recall that 4 years ago there was zero in the references to gender equality and gender equity in the negotiating text. Now we have references in major parts of the negotiating text, in adaptation, in technology, in the finance section, and these are very important. Even though these negotiations, we haven't yet seen the light at the end of the tunnel, we have some confidence that much of what the women's organizations working with the UN, working with governments have brought into the negotiating text will stay. We have confidence. And Gosling mentioned that at the country level, how will change happen? We at UNDP have been trying to identify some critical areas that can make an impact, and climate financing is one of those areas we have been focusing on. We selected some of the funds that we feel have the strongest potential to empower poor women in the poorest countries, and have been working with the governance bodies of these funds, supporting them and lobbying them and giving them a capacity to be able to introduce gender equity guidelines in the operations of these funds. And now, for example, the Climate Investment Fund and the Adaptation Fund have introduced operational guidelines that include very specific requirements for mainstreaming gender in the proposals that they are going to fund. And in addition to that, because we have a presence in 166 developing countries, we've been able to work through our network and support some of the countries that are applying for those funds to prepare through effective consultations with women's organizations at the country level, and using gender expertise to prepare proposals that will address the different needs of men and women through the funding that they are going to obtain. So this is something that we are also bringing into the Green Climate Fund, which is a big issue in the negotiation here. We've worked with the Secretariat of the Transitional Committee that has been drafting the instrument of the Green Climate Fund, and we've been able to introduce some guidelines. For example, a requirement for gender balance of the board that will make the decisions on the climate financing, an introduction of gender equity principles in the operations, in the stakeholder consultations, which are critical, the importance of consulting with women and indigenous people, and quite a number of other provisions in that text. So we hope that the Green Climate Fund is going to be endorsed here, and that the text we have put there will be carried forward. But as Gottlin says, taking it down to building the capacity to make proposals and projects that address men and women's needs, and removing those structural constraints that are not climate related, but that are compounded by climate change, like property rights and so on. It's going to take time, but this is a beginning, and a good beginning.
And the whole climate debate is dominated by statistics. Anywhere you go, there will be graphs and charts and people issuing 500-page reports. In terms of the work that UNDP has been doing, and also the work that your organisation, Gotland, has been doing as well, are there statistics out there that demonstrate the effect that effective education can have on cutting carbon emissions?
I don't know. I haven't seen such statistics. Would be wonderful, because then we would know that if we better educate people, they will actually be successful in cutting carbon emissions. So we have some statistics on gender and carbon emissions. So for instance, we know that in some European countries, men have a larger carbon footprint than women. This is not because, you know, women are the better people, but that their lives are still, even in Europe, are different from the lives of men, and their roles are different. And I think this is all something we need, of course, to address in development policy, but we also need to address this in mitigation policies in industrialized countries.
Well, this is an interesting question you have raised. Many, many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was looking at an energy model for the countries where I come from, the countries of East Africa. And I found that there was a very skewed policy, energy policy in our region, East Africa, that the cost of petrol, which is the gas for private cars, the salon cars that are owned by rich people, mostly men, was subsidized 9 times more than the cost of kerosene. Kerosene is the same fuel as actually jet fuel, but it is the fuel of the poor. It's the fuel that poor women use to light their homes in rural Africa. It is the fuel that is used by buses, public transportation, and lorries where the poor travel. That was subsidized much, much less than petrol, the fuel of the rich, 9 times more petrol of the rich. So you could see that the whole energy policy of the country was skewed, of actually all the 3 African countries were skewed, and that's a long, long time ago, was skewed towards supporting the consumption patterns of the rich and actually leaving the poor to struggle without enough energy access for their transportation and for their household needs, where women need the energy to sustain livelihood. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of collecting data, not just about men and women, but across various sectors, across different activities, and seeing how policy is supporting climate resilience and reducing carbon emissions. And we don't have enough gender disaggregated data across various sectors, and it's people like Gotland and others who are contributing to developing this evidence that we need to make better policy.
But if I may come back to education, so I think education plays a huge role for climate change policies, both for adaptation and mitigation. So we're, for instance, working with grassroots women in South Africa, here in KwaZulu-Natal and other regions in South Africa, and their need for information and for capacity building is huge. And so this is, for instance, something that finance should also provide, because they need to know how they have to change their agricultural practices in combination with their traditional knowledge. And on the other hand, we need to educate people about consumption. And this is both valid for people in developed countries, in industrialized countries, and also the richer people in developing countries, because their carbon footprints are also already pretty big. And here we also see a gender dimension, because the information needs to reach the women as well as the men, and there are different needs for information, different channels, and different ways how the information needs to be provided in order to really reach the target group. I think you as a media person know this quite well.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we've only got about a minute and a half left, but just a quick one to finish with. We have current head of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, COP17 President, Minister Mashabane, and obviously COP16 President, Minister Espinosa. How much confidence, first, Winnie, does that give you that this issue is being addressed? And do you think the work done by these women at the very top of the climate change debate, does that give you hope and confidence moving forward?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I don't subscribe to the notion of women being pure and holy and better. Absolutely not. But I happen to believe that the head of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, and the president of the COP, Minister Mashabane, are very competent women. And I have every confidence that they are going to steer this meeting towards the best outcome. But I also know that the countries, both rich and developing, are now very much aware of the importance of making progress and that on this issue, and that the clock is ticking. So I think it's going to be a joint responsibility and grow a recognition that time is not on our side, that we may lose our planet. And we are hopeful for a positive outcome, and we as UNDP are here really to support member states to make informed decisions, to avail them all the knowledge and the experience and the resources that we have gathered to assist them to make good decisions here and to go back and implement what they have agreed.
And a quick one finally to you, Gotland, is that a sentiment you would go along with?
Yes, and I think that it's really important, even if it's only a symbolic thing, that there's more women, in these decision-making positions. I think that's really important. Also, it's not the full solution. We need much more. But I think these women, they have a little bit more, they're interested in bringing in the human aspect of climate change into the whole issue. And I think that is what we need. Because in the beginning of the climate debate, people thought, well, climate is a scientific problem. But we now know it's a human issue, and I think it doesn't make sense to rescue the climate without the people.
Marvellous. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today. Can we have a quick round of applause for Winnie and Gotland? Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone watching us on the internet for our webcast today on the second Monday of COP17.